Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Who Needs a Standard Family, aka Ensuring BIM Optimization. This webinar is brought to you by Applied Software. My name is Caitlin Dunn, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. All right, here we go with the intro video. Hi, and welcome to this Applied Software webinar. We're glad you could join us today. Get more out of the webinar by clicking on the icons at the bottom of your screen. You can resize these. This button leads to resources. This button adjusts the volume. Just don't push this one. I'm watching you. Be sure to find Applied Software on social media and on our website, asti.com, where we'll empower you to discover what's possible. You can also find a complete schedule of upcoming events, on-demand webinars, and training on our calendar at asti.com/calendar. This is being recorded for your convenience. You'll be receiving an email with the recording link for future reference. And make sure to stick around. We'll answer questions at the end. See you there.
Great. Glad you're here. So my name is Lance Kirby. I'm Director of Services here at Applied Software. I have been around the BIM game for a long time, and so this is well within our expertise to talk about performance of families. So that's what I'm going to get into today. I have a couple of ideas about what I think are important to talk about here. So let's jump into a couple of things. See if I can get our slides going here.
Looks like we're good.
Great, thank you. So what may have brought you here, right? If you're thinking about families, content, performance, there are lots of things that challenge that, right? One of the things I think about is, families being consistent and predictable as part of the deliverables, right? They're the things that hold the information, that hold the geometry, right? So they're very important projects. They also impact things that are standards in terms of how we deliver projects, in terms of like level of development. They impact COBE requirements, all kinds of things that then make a good process for the entire life cycle of the design process. I also think too, it's about having content available for people and the challenges around, making the parts outside the content perform better, right? So your people, your processes, and the technology to manage those things. But I also think too, you could have a lot of planning and standards and good templates and all those good things, but if you don't govern them consistently, then you may be experiencing some performance problems that way. So hopefully some of these things may resonate with you as you're thinking about, what you want to get out of this. Again, so I've been around Revit for almost 22 years now. So my first real family I remember creating was at Revit Technologies as part of the support team in 2000 when I joined. And that was in version 1, and then beta version 2, working on parametric, I believe it was parametric trusses, so if you can believe that or not. So working on complex families almost 22 years ago. Wow. Anyway, so things we want to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about, how content is related, in this case specifically families, how that's related to performance. When I think about performance, I'm not just talking about, how fast the computer's running or loading and saving models, but also the process of doing things, right? Executing your work, but also too how productive your staff is. So we'll talk about some solutions, building a framework for improving performance, and how that continue to improve over time. And then I'll have some closing thoughts. I'll talk about maybe some things that you could do to implement some of these solutions. And then certainly too, hopefully we've got some questions we can we can talk about as well. All right. And just a preface, there's a lot of information in these slides. I'm going to try to touch on everything. Certainly, having 22 years of experience with families, I can go down the rabbit hole. So I'm going to be careful of that today. So how are families connected to performance? And I go back to people, process, technology. Those are all something that we can measure the performance of. You think tools, obviously the technology to create families and manage families and all those things, that's important. But to me, that's the least important, the least impactful of all these things. It's what you're doing with it every day that talks about performance. But it's also people. What are their skill sets? What are their roles and responsibilities? What's their mindset? And how these other things support them in doing their jobs. And so the first thing you have to realize that content is everywhere. And when you think about what a model is, it's just full of families, right? System families, regular families, things that we've created, things that manufacturers have created, things that we're managing. All that comes together, geometric and data-driven to form these models. So content is everywhere. The creation process of creating good content takes time. I mean, there are some simple annotation content that's pretty straightforward, but then you can get on the other side of that some very complex, air handling units or structural items that need to have a catalog of things that have lots of information embedded, and there are lots of places to potentially make mistakes that therefore then impact the performance. But you also get things that we download from manufacturers, and they've been getting better at this over the years. But certainly their focus should be on providing the right data and the right sizing of assemblages, but they aren't necessarily worried about your performance. And so that's why you always have to kind of evaluate things that you bring from the outside in that aren't maybe necessarily aligned with your content standards. And then there's also things that, we get into the habit of building and over modeling and over complicating things that we create. And sometimes these, we pull things like a fabrication style model from a manufacturer. It might be very geometrically correct, but at the same time, it could really be sapping the performance of your model. One example I can give you that I worked on a few years ago was my customer had a overhead rolling door that was literally over 100 megabytes, one single family. Now, it was only in the model 2 or 3 times, but that was a huge impact on the model, right? It was that complicated. It had imported things. There were lots of artifacts, and it frankly was a problem, right? So families can definitely impact the performance of a lot of things. All right? So how are we going to improve this performance? Through families. So I've kind of divided this into 3 different ways of thinking about it. There are things that we're going to do before we do our day-to-day work. There are things that we're doing from day to day as we're managing the model, creating content, using content. And there are things that we do afterwards. What is the reaction to that? What have we learned from that process? And then how does that carry forward and make things better over time? So that's the way I've laid this out. Okay. So to me, part of this really starts with how do we define the process ahead of the time? And that is standards, templates. And that is not only to kind of set the beginning stage, the direction we want to go with content, but it also sets expectations for people, right? So people know, your team knows, hey, this is how we're going to treat this content. This is how we're going to use it. This is what it was intended for. And if it isn't, then it's my responsibility to react to that, right? To help carry change forward. So we're going to talk about, why standards are important, who owns these processes, and frankly, what standards are the most impactful, right? Because we could write a standard for every single thing, and that's going to fail because that's just too much for us to have to go through. So I'll get into that as well. All right. So why are standards important? All right. So to me, standards, frankly, are about the people. They're about benchmarking your ability, your team's ability to do the work, right? And so it's not about the thing that you're standardizing unto itself. It's never without a context, right? The context to me is always about the team. So standards should always be geared toward the team that you have, or frankly, the team that you're growing into, right? The kind of trying to beat that trajectory of where we're going to be in a year or whatever. You think about the old CAD standards we used to do, and it was based on a lot of times the software. The software wants to do this layering scheme or leveling scheme, and these colors mean this, and often it wasn't about the workflow that people are doing, right? It was implying or imposing a system that often didn't have people squarely in the target. Okay. Now, to me, a standard is a benchmark, right? You have to start with a standard and also set expectations as the beginning point, right? Here's where we're starting. Here's where we want to go. And so if you don't have it as a benchmark of what's expected, then you can't then later analyze if that is meeting the expectations or not, right? So it's always important to say, here is the standard of work. Here's what we're going to do. And at the end of it, I can evaluate, did we meet that expectation, right? That's a part of it. Now, the thing about benchmarks and standards in general is that they're a blessing and a curse, right? So they're something you have to be careful of in terms of how much you put into effect, because certainly they can give you, they can put people on the right path, but they can also slow people down, right? And the whole point is not necessarily slow down, but to make things easier for them. And that should, in all intents and purposes, get them moving quicker, more effective, more efficient, right? Innovative, based on what we're shooting for in terms of our standards. So benchmarks too can also, push people off in terms of, hey, you're questioning my ability to do my job, right? And there may be some emotions involved, right? So you got to be careful with how you apply benchmarks, right? So to me, good standards address a lot of things. And when I say standards, I'm specifically thinking about good quality content, right? And so I've written out a few things here, and a lot of this is from sources that we've used over the years. I mean, I really was a big fan of the SEEK standards back a long time ago. That's probably 10 or 12 years ago. But the intent of those things was to get manufacturers to build a certain way that was responsive to the industry. Thing is, it was also a useful way for us to build our own content that then fit into the same kind of content library and content management systems. I think you have to have an intent. Why does this object need to exist, right? What's the level of detail that it needs to exist in? Is it something that's just going to be used in schematic? Does it need to transform over time based on levels of detail that we're adding to it? Can we switch it out with something else? Are the parameters changeable? Instance versus type, those kinds of things. I also think about accuracy. Now, accuracy really comes down, obviously we think a lot of times about geometry, but accuracy could be about the data, right? How accurate is the data? Is it, 1.1 or is it 1.123, right? What's the reality? Thing is, what is our tolerance and what do we need to know in order to make that thing efficient? Because keep in mind, when we're talking about performance, it's not just how fast the computer processes these things. It's also about how we as human beings use this information effectively, right? So it could really be fast saving and opening and closing and doing things, but if it takes us longer to do something because the content is standing in our way, it's preventing us from being productive, then to me that's a performance problem based on the family, right? I also think about too, data criteria is very important. I mean, obviously the visual thing strikes you first, but we know the real power of building information modeling is the information, right? The fact that I can convey data to other people that may be less inclined to worry about whether this thing has enough geometry to be rendered and more about, does it have the right manufacturer's information? Does it have information for my costing? All those kinds of things. So coming up with common naming conventions, the types of parameters that we're going to use, how much, the graphics need to be built in, those kinds of things are important. Now, we've been talking about performance in general, but also, too, you can specifically plan how a family is to perform, right? So, I can detail whether I'm going to use a catalog or not, or if it's going to be streamlined based on the usage, and that's going to run quickly because I have to use lots of different versions of it, and all these things. So all these other parts could influence the performance, which you can then plan into that family. And then finally, standards also have to talk about testing, right? Because if we build all these great features into our family and then we throw it out there to be used and it fails, how did we plan on that? What was the mitigation for it failing? Go back and repair it? Well, what if we ran into some testing problems and were able to make those changes even before it got into a project? Right? That's going to save us time. That's going to increase the performance of the team. So we should always be testing these things ahead of them being used on project work. All right. So who participates in this process? Now, I think to me, I can lump you into mostly two groups, right? You're either kind of using the content or you're kind of managing and developing the content. Now, obviously, there might be people who are wearing two hats, right? Or they're subject matter experts and might fall more on the BIM coordination side and kind of have responsibilities on both sides. But the way I position this is that there are people that really need to be kind of managing the process. How do we create families? How do we manage those families? The QA/QC effort of content that we're creating. Is it failing, and who's responsible for changing it? How does it come into the workflow? Where's this library kept? How do we access it? That's kind of the BIM manager's role. Then there's the user, and you think, okay, well, the user is kind of a lesser role. Actually, to me, that's probably more important to some degree, because these are the people actually getting the work done, and how effective they are, how efficient they are, is frankly a reflection of all the things that we're doing elsewhere, right? So to me, they're the client in this, right? So we need to make sure that, one, that things are easily accessible, that they're, attempting to follow standards and tell us why they aren't following standards and what that means, and how do we, we deviate from our plan based on that. But we also want their feedback, and I'll talk more about that later. But to me, that's the user is really, I'm going to say not the canary in the coal mine, but really the person that we need to be gearing all our efforts toward, right? So the challenge often too is some of families really are a balance between kind of the performance need, right? Be useful, quick, efficient, easy, versus design complexity. Some things just unfortunately need to be complex, need to be, stretched and pulled and, perform a certain way and make adjustments automatically. I mean, so those are two sides of the scale that we need to decide, what's the right balance for us. Okay. And it could vary on projects. I mean, you can have some, a plethora of very simple things. You can have a lot of complexity, and it might be a mishmash of both. But it's important to understand, not to make things more complex than they need to be, and not to make things more simple than they need to be, right? So there's a sweet spot in there for all these things that we need to keep of, and just to make sure that the parameters, the parametric relationships are not killing us, that we don't have a ton of types, 1,000 types of things that we need to be able to, go through. I mean, if you ever have selected steel in a model before, it takes some time to go through that long catalog. And it's not because we've made it overly complicated. It's just the world of steel sizes is varied, right? It's got a lot of options. And so, somehow we have to decide, well, what's right for our project? How many of these do we put in? And how many do I provide to the user to decide what to use, right? So those are some of the challenges with doing content. So how do we plan on well-performing content? Now, the thing is, we want content to be used. We want it to be useful. We want it to provide value to our project teams. But we can also be thinking about, how is this going to perform and how can I make this the most efficient for them? I don't want the complexity or the poor performance of content to be a barrier to getting the project done on time and on budget, frankly. So, think about two major things. I think, efficient geometry is pretty big, but I also think about the parametric constraints, right? So the geometry is, that tends to be more of an obvious one, right? Like if I build 20 different parameter-driven arrays within the same object, and I'm making it more complicated than it needs to be, or I'm adding more geometry that really does not convey or communicate its ability to be built, I have to question that, right? Years ago, I thought about, people were complaining about performance in a model, and I was looking through families, and I remember seeing an office desk that had a laptop, it had a mouse with a cord, it had a lamp, and the lamp had a light bulb, and then a cord, and then it had a CPU. It was a very intricate model. And I thought, this is lovely if I'm going to do a rendering or I'm trying to convey a sense of, what the work environment looks like to my customer. But at the end of the day, if I'm just trying to get contract documents out, this is a hindrance. Right, this is getting in the way based on the performance because the model was just a laggard, right? It wouldn't move because it just had carried so much extra weight, right? So geometry is important to think about, but there's also this idea of parametric constraints, right? And if you've ever locked a parameter from one object to another and tried to move one object and had errors pop up or things fail because of the relationship, it's very complex. And that feature is amazing, being able to kind of set rules on objects and how their relationship with each other. You just have to realize that sometimes that doesn't work as intended, right? And so you have to be, you have to figure out, when I make a decision to tie two objects together, is this really important? Is this something that I can let the system kind of deal with? Or is this something that can be modified with some other kind of manual process when it does need it? Is that going to save us some time and effort later as well? So that's something you want to think about. All right. I also think too, design intent versus performance is important to think about. And again, it goes back to, what's the purpose of this content? As I mentioned in an example earlier, where I had a desk full of parts and pieces that weren't about the construction or even the layout of a space. What's the intent of that? Was the intent to render, right? And so I can make decisions based on what are we putting this model together for, right? And could there be another process to handle those kinds of things? Can I have a replacement process that I create to switch those things out? We're working on our consulting group years ago at Autodesk was working on Starbucks. And Starbucks was in the process of building content libraries for both production and visualization. And so those were two sets of catalogs that were being managed. So, one object, let's say it was an espresso machine, might be highly detailed to be put into a rendering in order to get a franchisee to buy into it. But then that would be switched out with a basic box that said, yeah, this is, this thing is made in Italy and it's, 2 feet by 3 feet by 4 feet, and then it sits here, right? So even the two objects were represented with the object was represented by two different families, their intents were different and therefore were part of different processes, right? Also, too, I think, the LOD is important. Because often you think, okay, if the object is very basic and only needs to be basic, I don't need to have more detail into it. But if it's something that needs to change over time without necessarily changing position, or us having to go through some process to flip it to some more complex version, then the object itself is going to grow with the LOD. And so, that's something you want to think about too. What's the intent of where that thing starts and where it ends? But also, too, is this a complex thing that's only going to appear a couple of times, like an in-place family, or is it something I'm going to repeat 1,000 times? And so that will then tell you or inform you how to build that content or manage that content in order to fit the intent. All right. So talking about standards, which of these standards really provide the most impact? Okay. So I put, and these are not by any means all of them. I think these are just some that I think have been important to me in building content strategies, and standards for the creation of families. So obviously I just mentioned that level of detail, understanding how much information needs to go into it, and then how does that change with various view changes, right? And then when we change that over time from schematic to DD all the way into CDs. I also think about file size. Now the SEEK standards were really good years ago, talking about how a family was mostly something that needed to be less than a megabyte. And so to me, that was always a great litmus test. In fact, they used to run model checks, and anything over a megabyte, I would point out and list and challenge the users to update and condense, to remove some complexity. But to me, that might be an arbitrary number now. I mean, computers have gotten faster. Our ability to pick up performance gains elsewhere, but still need additional data. That to me, that's just kind of an example as a benchmark that you could certainly raise or lower, or even have exceptions, right? Like, okay, this HVAC equipment could be 2 megabytes, but doors need to be less than 750K. Whatever your standard needs to manage. I also think categorization is very important, because often when we create content, we are starting with a template that says, hey, you're going to be in this particular category. And that category is important, because category really informs a lot of things in terms of view, in terms of COBie exports, all kinds of other systems, IFC, other databases that are going to be pulling more and more information over time. So categorization is important. Doesn't mean that you can't have some generic models in there, but just keep in mind that you're breaking the intent of BIM with miscategorization, right? And you say, okay, well, how does that influence performance? Well, it does change from category to category how the features work and how the parameters function, all kinds of things. So you may not be able to foresee all those problems. So if you can stick into a category, do. Okay. Usage again, that goes back to what's the purpose of this thing? Why are we using it? Is it just for documentation? Is it for a 2D layout? Maybe it's even something as complicated as doing a rendering that I want to have a lot of detail. So deciding, you may break your library up into multiple parts. Maybe you have a render set of content versus a documentation set of content. I mean, you can manage it that way. Geometry, again, is important to think about in terms of, what are the right types of geometry? What types of geometry are less complex than others? Thinking about trying to describe an arc versus a faceted curve. Those have different performance opportunities. They then end up looking different in the model or different in the drawings, right? So just something to think about. Obviously, the more points, the more, coordinates that the computer has to think about and process whenever it loads and unloads, saves, but also where it changes, right? So if I change the parameters of something, what's driving that? If it's so complex that at some point it has to do a lot of calculations, that's going to change performance, right? But I also think, too, something that not everybody thinks about, and is the case to me where a lot of problems end up, is embedment. When I say embedment, things embedded into the family that are not useful or are no longer useful, right? Because I think it's okay to be building content and then bring in templates or 2D diagrams of things from outside. I mean, a very common one is I'm going to rebuild something from, say, an AutoCAD file. I'm going to load that AutoCAD file in, I'm going to trace around it, and then you end up maybe turning it off instead of deleting it, getting rid of it and clearing it up. And so it ends up being an artifact inside that family. And if that family's then copied around everywhere, suddenly now that is propagated, right? And that will kill your performance. So it's just, keep in mind that once you put things in, you got to, if they're no longer useful, take them out. And that's also true for parameters. I mean, if you put parameters in that are not useful anymore, get rid of them, right? Okay, so doing things day to day. What are we doing day to day, right? So we're going to talk about the workflow of adding content. I want to talk about kind of the accessibility of content. But I also want to get the fact that as users are doing things, they're going to give you feedback, right? This works or doesn't work. What do we do with that? Okay. So to me, it's important to have a workflow for adding content. Okay. Now, often teams that are not, have not planned, content comes from everywhere. I'm going to go the old Revit city. I'm going to go to the manufacturer's website. I'm going to pull something from the last project that nobody looked at. I'm going to create something on the fly. Okay. Those are just common ways people get content in there. You have to be purposeful about how you want content to come in. You might say, okay, we're going to go through some process. It's going to be owned by the BIM manager, and if you want content, you got to go through them. Okay, well, there's some great benefits to that, but there's also some other barriers, right? Like if I have one person that becomes the bottleneck for all that stuff, then it's going to slow my project down because I'm having to wait for them to approve this thing that I need, or go and find this thing, or make this thing that I need. So I think, to me, a good middle ground is be thinking about, okay, let's give multiple people responsibility, skill sets to do these things. Let's set these standards that we talked about and have people create content based on the ways that we have approved, right? And then we'll come back and look at that later, right? And and as people create things, I'll be able to harvest things that are good and evaluate them, and then include them in the library, or improve them with additional work, or frankly push it back and say, this doesn't work because of these things, right? But the thing is, it's intent. It's having a clear direction for people building these things. Okay. Now, there are lots of mistakes that you can make when creating families. The thing for me, and I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on going through these. In fact, we'll publish these slides out so you can go and review them. And by the way, these are, if you can find those old SEEK standards, I got a lot of these from there. But not having a plan for your standards. Okay, so that's a problem, right? So have a plan, have it communicated. When we talk about unnecessary relationships, locking objects to objects that, really bog down the parametric change with very little benefit, right? Could I change two different things separately and they be connected to, say, a grid line as opposed to connected together? That may be more efficient. So you got to study some of those things over time. Geometry also too, if I'm trying to talk about a diagram in 2D, but I put a 3D line in there, then that's not not useful. I'm going to go back and have to change that. Things like that. Things like overusing voids and formulas and arrays, like making things more complicated than they need to be, right? Like sometimes somebody, and I've been guilty of this myself. I mean, I remember doing years ago, maybe 15, 17 years ago, building a door that really could become all doors, right? So it was a single flush, it could become a double flush, it could somehow pop a light in. Well, you start to figure this stuff out. I mean, it could do some amazing things. Like I could drag a void over here from nothing all the way into the solid object by using a parameter. And you think, wow, this is really cool. But you're also making it so complicated that nobody else can work on it, that when it fails, you've got to spend maybe hours trying to figure out what failed. So don't make those things so complicated that it's just unusable, right? So when it works, it's great, but when it doesn't work, you just throw it away, right? But there's several more here. I'll let you kind of peruse some of the things. My big thing here at the end, though, is not testing. Like if you're going to create a family, test it, right? See if it works. Like push and pull on it. Do something stupid to it so that it proves to you that you're not doing the right thing. Because guess what? A user is going to do that. Or the user might not even intentionally do that. It might be just the nature of the context that it sits in the model, that it does something crazy, right? So not only is it useful to figure out where it works, but also where it fails, okay? So lots of different ways to make and plan performance. And there's some common mistakes that get in the way. All right. Now, when I talk about easy accessibility, that's, to me, that probably is the easiest thing to fix, but seems to me the least common thing that we do fix. Okay. What I mean by that is, how do people get to content? They either pull it from, it's already there in the template. It's in a file structure. They're using a program like Unify or Avail. They get this content, right? What did we communicate to them where they're supposed to get it? Like one that really just irks me to no end is this idea that I'm going to go back to the last project that I worked on and pull something out because I remember that being good. Okay, that may be true. That thing may have been amazing. But guess what? If nobody looked at it and nobody checked the performance of it and it was bad, guess what? It's still bad and you're making your new project bad, right? So I think it's important to really be able to organize that content, have a structure for it, make it easily accessible, but then be able to measure that accessibility. What I mean by that is, and it says qualitative and quantitative, right? So I'm going to jump down to qualitative first because I think, to me, that's where we think logically. How quickly, how many clicks does it take for me to get to this family to go and load it into my project, right? How many clicks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll? Or you think about it qualitatively, like if you've laid out a very quick process, but it's difficult for people still to use, it's probably not simple for your users, and therefore you have failed, right? So think about what their reaction to this layout is. Oh, I don't like that folder. I didn't go there. This was too hard. I need to go over here. Okay, well, let's talk about it. Do we need to meet in the middle? Both change? Do I need to change? Do you need to change? What can I get buy-in for? Can you go to this one extra folder? Can you use this system we've installed? Right? So there's the user aspect. What does the user think? Is it easy to get to? Right? And again, this is just a form of feedback. So anything that we do, we need to be getting feedback from our users. I mean, to me, that's really important because I could come up and I could provide to you today. You could call me and say, Lance, give me like the most amazing content management strategy ever. And if you expected me to hand you a box full of amazing standards and content and templates and all those kinds of things, you'd be wrong. Because I know I've got to understand how you do things, how you work, who's working there, what are their skill sets, what type of work that you do. All these things are going to contribute to what a successful strategy is. So we really have to think about the right thing to do is what's good for us, right? So there's no perfect solution. There's only the solution that we're willing to buy into and to execute on. Okay? So your most important litmus test is the user. Is the user happy with the way this works? Right? Is it useful to them? So I ask questions about my users that I deal with content strategy. I think about I'd say, what is the specific feedback from users? I mean, so if there is very specific feedback, I think you got to record that. So anything, to me, I've got to evaluate. Are they finding it easily enough? Is it meeting their content needs? Is it the right content that we've built? Are the standards helping them, right? And when we say standards, is the direction we've set for them the right direction? Did the templates build? Did we build them too complex? Did we build them not complex enough? What are the templates like? So there are a lot of different ways to actually get feedback. I like quick surveys. right? Something like a SurveyMonkey or Microsoft Forms is good. Those are very easy to make and communicate. You can send links and people can just do them. The thing is, obviously, people are kind of tired of getting a lot of surveys, so that might be too formal for them. But what's nice about those things is you can actually get some metrics. So if I ask you 3 questions and then 10 people answered, then I can start to see some patterns. Like, okay, this is the number 1 request for us. This is something that's going to be high priority, right? That's the kind of way we can make decisions based on finding those patterns. I think it's good to empower stakeholders. What I mean by that is if I have a lot of people using my content and then, I get feedback that it's not optimal, okay? Then instead of just going off and fixing it and then, trying it again, I try to get them involved. Excuse me. So is it something that they can help us improve, right? Can I get some high-end users that are very critical of our content help us continue to create additional content or evaluate content? I mean, you can even make it fun by having something like a pinup, right? Like, let's once a month in the CAD and BIM meeting, let's look at some of the content that we're creating. I think that's interesting. It gives people the ability to challenge the standards, but also do some work on their own. I will guarantee you, if somebody's interested, they'll end up, doing more from you than you're doing for them. But whatever you learn and you get feedback on, to me, communicating the fact that the feedback is useful is important, right? Because no one ever wants to spend time giving you feedback saying, hey, I think this is the things that we need to do on this content, handing it over and never hearing about it again. I think that's a big mistake. So even if it's not the best, constructive criticism of your content, you got to react to it. You got to say, I hear what you're saying. I'm going to work on this. Here's what we've done to address your concerns. That's going to go a long way for people continue to get the buy-in for what you're doing and not abandon your system. Because to me, that's where all this fails. If I create a standard, if I create templates, if I create content that nobody uses or uses unpredictably, then I've screwed up. Okay? Now, the last thing we want to think about with this content is how do we measure performance to ensure that we're actually getting to the type of performance, the optimal performance that we want to get to. And that is thinking about the metrics, being able to analyze those metrics in a meaningful way, and then doing something about it, right? Actionable, continual improvement, okay? So measuring impact to me is interesting. Like what do we need to be measuring? And you'll notice here that I've got people first, then process, then technology. Now, a lot of people think performance, immediately they go to technology. Like, what are the size of these components? How fast is the model load? Things like that. The number of warnings I get in the model. Those are important, and those are actually easy to measure. I can get some automated reports out of those things. I can pull data into Power BI and, create a dashboard and say, hey, this project's redlining. That's really cool. However, I go back again to the people side. People side is the most important because that impacts the bottom line. And in fact, if you're trying to convince your leadership that we need to spend more on these processes, that we're, as a BIM manager, I'm doing my job because I'm seeing productivity gains in this workflow. You're going to measure that with people. And that could be, hours based on particular roles doing a particular project. Could be how many issues they've logged this week in the help system. All those kinds of things relate to people and their skill sets, right? So, something from that, and I'll get into the analysis of it, but I also think, what do we learn from all of these things? Now, in between, I think about processes, and that's a pretty common one, because that is something that you can think about. Oh, I've got certain amount of time planned for this process. Did I actually do it in the time planned? Is it Was it quicker or was it longer? Right? Those are the kind of things I think work through the process fairly easy. But all those things, I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg for what you can measure. All we'd be thinking about, are they impactful? Is it easy to measure? And can I get value from that measurement? All right. I also think about, once I have these measurements, what do I do with them? How do I analyze this for things that are meaningful in my workflow? How do I get my people to change? And do we need different technology? Do we need new processes? Do I need new people, which is really difficult to get nowadays? But I think, to me, that's why I said I've got a couple people up here. But I think you have to start to think about or evaluate. You might identify based on some measurement that, hey, we could get productivity, to increase by X percent if we do, Y training and I spend Z amount of time, governing the process. Okay. Well, that's kind of a value proposition, right? If we spend this dollar here, we're going to make $3 later on. Okay. And that's something you can go through with a lot of these measurements. What is it going to take to improve the performance based on things that we're doing around the content, whether what people are doing, those people themselves, or the content that we're providing to them. I also, again, go back to that kind of perception, right? And if the perception is that we're not efficient, it doesn't matter if we actually are efficient or not. I mean, you could say, okay, we've improved, 10% on how quickly we're able to do this process. But if people are complaining about having to do this new process, I have to consider that it's not an actual improvement because the perception is. So I either got to figure out what that perception is and why it's caused, or I got to go a different direction, right? Because perception is reality in a lot of cases here. In terms of process, I think you also think about, you got to weigh it against the whole. So if I improved one thing over here by 5 minutes, but I've lost, because of that, I've lost 10 minutes somewhere else. Okay. That's something I have to evaluate, but I have to evaluate based on the entire project, right? I can't just think about, hey, I've improved at 5 here, and I'm going to ignore these other problems, right? And then again, technology. Technology allows us to measure a lot of different things, and we're doing things. And if you're not familiar with the kind of the lead versus lag indicator, lead is things that we're doing all the time. Lag is the result of that, right? And so, by doing cleaning up families or loading the right families or creating content based on standards, those are good lead indicators. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what did it do? What did all that effort accomplish? And that's where a lag indicator comes in. And you think about, and to me, it's when you go on a diet, and I'm one of those guys, I feel like I'm constantly on a diet, but I'm trying to lose 10 pounds, or in my case, 40 pounds. But what am I doing every day to get to that 40 pounds? If I get on the scale every day and says, hey, I didn't lose 40 pounds today. Okay, did you lose anything today? Okay, that's to me, that's less important than what are the things that I'm doing to actually accomplish that? Am I eating less calories? Am I working out? Am I running to the mailbox? Whatever it is that I've planned to do to get me to that weight loss, that's something I consider. So about lead indicators, think about the lag as being the last part of that. All right. So again, all this stuff is for naught if we don't continue to improve. And I've talked about this in some of the other webinars, this idea of continual improvement. It's just something we just tend to forget about on the end. We think, okay, I'm doing QA/QC. Okay, great. But what did QA/QC do for the process, right? If I tell you, hey, here's all the problems in your drawings, go fix them. Okay, great. All right, did you actually go back and say, what caused those errors? Was it training problem? Was it a problem in the standards? Was it an issue with this person? How do you fix that? How do you prevent that from happening in the future, right, on future projects? The other side of it is maintenance, this idea of maintenance. And I know I've included in here. To me, it's actually probably not the best term, because you think maintenance is I'm always doing the same thing. I'm going to continue, right? Well, the thing is, what if we could ramp this stuff up? What if we could continually improve it? So if I measure the performance and I see an improvement over time, that is a more admirable goal, right? So, it's about creating a system. It's about a method for reviewing these things. It's about doing it constantly over time, and about communicating. What have we learned? What are we doing differently? And getting people involved on that. I think that all those are important for continual improvement. All right. So I'm going to try to give us a few minutes for questions. I want to just wrap up with a couple more things. So closing thoughts, right? Right number of standards. And when I say right number, it's, enough to give us the right direction, but not too much to prevent us from getting there, right? And that's going to make it easy, right? You come up with a plan, follow it until you don't need to follow it. And what that means is we got to continue to change the plan based on feedback, right? So the plan is not going to be static, right? But then again, measure twice, change once. Like the old adage, measure twice, cut once. That's not true in this case. We're going to be measuring all the time, right? And you got to be constantly knowing if you're winning or losing so that you can change directions, right? That's important, okay? So what can you do about this, right? So as I said, defining your performance goals, and as I said, being achievable and practical, right? Defining things that you know that you can do, but also things that you're willing to do, right? Like I could probably run 3 miles right now or 5 miles. Am I willing to do that? Well, what's the purpose, right? So both achievable and practical. All right. You also need to evaluate your current performance as a benchmark to know, what your times are going to become, right? Being able to start tracking it. So you can start doing that. I also think, you come up with a development plan for doing some objectives around improving your content, whether it be, implementing a content strategy, measuring all along the way, all those kinds of things. Now, certainly we have a ton of experience doing this. As I said, just me, I've been doing this for 22 years. I've built content management strategies for government agencies and large entities. So, certainly we can and would love to help you develop these things. And, so we can help define that performance. We can develop some timelines, some standards, build templates for you. We can help you measure these things. We can also connect this to your learning and development. Where do you need to pick up productivity on the people side? Because to me, that's the biggest investment, right? So we want to be thinking about that as being the most important thing. But we also have a service called BIM Management as a service, where this is right in that wheelhouse. So we can provide a person so many hours, an expert, subject matter expert, so many hours a month to help you define the strategy to improve the performance of your families. And together, I think we can succeed on all these things. All right? So I want to open it up for some questions. And, if you want to get specific about some things, we can do that. If you want to talk about framework, I will try to answer anything you throw at me. All right.
I don't see any questions so far, but Lance, in case anyone just wants to reach out to you in the future, what would be the best way for them to get a hold of you?
You can find me at L Kirby, that's Lima Kirby, at ASTI.com. And I work at least 8 hours a weekday.
Perfect. Well, you know what? I can go ahead and wrap things up. And if we see any questions pop up, feel free to either interrupt me or I'll stop myself and we can read those out. Does that work for you?
Yep, great. And so when I take from no questions, that means I was clear and concise and I gave all the right information. So everybody's now on the same page. Exactly.
Everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing, so they don't have any questions at all. That's usually what that means, I think. All right. Well, everybody out there, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you spending your time with us, and we trust that it was meaningful and impactful for you and your business. We look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks again, Lance. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Caitlin.